Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my joy to welcome you to this discussion on Pride Month. This is one of two forums that will be focusing on LGBTQ issues this month, and I joyously would like to welcome my friend, the Reverend Justin Crisp. Justin is the Associate Rector and Theologian in Residence at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan. And not only were we neighboring parishes in Connecticut, we also both were students at Yale Divinity School together. And Justin is also currently finishing up his PhD at Yale. And he is here to talk to us about what queer theology can tell us about sex. So thank you, Justin, for being here.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really, really grateful for the invitation and grateful to be with you, the people of St. Bart's here virtually. Which is, wish I could be with you in person, but under the circumstances, and rejoicing that I'm still able to be with you over Zoom here. In particular, I want to say hello on behalf of all of your friends at St. Mark's. I know that there are many in your congregation. So I've got a great deal that I actually want to talk with you about this morning, so I'm just going to jump right in. Let me pull the presentation up, and we'll begin. So my title this morning is Joy and Jouissance, which is a term I'll explain, what queer theology has to teach us about sex. And I'll return to the background of this slide a little later on in my presentation. I want to begin just by clarifying what I mean by queer theology. I want to be clear that the use of the word queer here is the recasting of what began undoubtedly as a pejorative and an insult. Okay, it's an attempt to appropriate it for a different use, for a liberating use, as a term of pride rather than as a term of shame, as a way for gesturing towards the political, moral, and theological importance of what the word queer was intended to discard, perhaps, in disgust. As for what queer actually means, it's pretty difficult to pin down. And in fact, that's actually the point of the word queer, period. As David Halperin, a so-called queer theorist in the humanities, as he puts it, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some definite object, but acquires its meaning from its oppositional relation to the norm. It's the fact that it resists identity, resists identification and normalization that makes the word queer potentially, politically, morally, I would say theologically useful. This experience of queerness is born from the experience of LGBTQIA, etc. People, folks with non-normative gender identities or sexualities, people whose lives are lived at a kind of tangent to the norms of sex and gender in our society. In particular, it attempts to learn from what their experience surfaces about human life in societies, institutions, cultures, maybe even churches like ours. Namely, that what exceeds the norm, the political, the social, the psychological norm, is often the object of political, social, psychological, even theological erasure, neglect, or violence. So queer theology is not so much about the inclusion of LGBT people, whether they should be ordained or whether they should be married, etc., as it is about the attempt to learn from their experience of sexual marginalization and to apply the fruit of that experience to theological issues, particularly the attention that their experience demands, that experience demands, to the erasure, the neglect, and the violence, as I said, by which we individually and socially attempt to manage what exceeds our control or classification. And in my dissertation, in my hopeful first book that I'm trying right now desperately to finish, that's what I'm trying to do with regard to sex itself. I'm not asking about the nature of sexual orientation or the question of who ought to do what with whom. I'm not actually interested in my dissertation in questions of inclusion of the normal sort, like should gay and lesbian people be ordained, or should they be married? But rather, I'm curious about what queerness has to teach us about sex itself. Not who can do what with whom, or who ought to do what with whom, but what it is that we're actually doing. In his famous 1989 address, The Body's Grace, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, suggests that non-heterosexual sex acts make certain truths about sex obvious, truths which are covered over or at least made difficult to see in heterosexual, reproductive, procreative sex acts. Because same-sex sex acts, he argues, are non-procreative, that is, because they can't result in pregnancy or childbirth, they raise the somewhat troubling question of what sex is for in itself. If sex isn't just for making babies, to put it crudely, what is sex for? Same-sex love, he says, annoyingly poses the question of what the meaning of desire is in itself, not considered as instrumental to some other process, like the peopling of the world. And this immediately brings us up against the possibility not only of pain and humiliation without any clear payoff, but just as worryingly, actually, of non-functional joy. If the Creator were quite so instrumentalist in his attitude to sexuality, these hints of prodigality and redundancy and the way the whole thing works might cause us to worry about whether he has, after all, full rational control of it. But if God made us for joy, might be a different story. My discussion today attempts to stare this question square in the face. What is this non-functional joy, which sex seems to be for, and what does queer experience teach us about it? My story begins with the late Michel Foucault, and with him, actually, the ancient Greeks and Romans. Foucault was a philosopher and an historian whose work is considered part of the founding canon of what goes by the name of queer theory in the university, particularly in the humanities disciplines, of which theology, I think, is one. Foucault was curious about why sex is a problem in a way that hunger is not. That's just an example, hunger. But what makes sex the object of such moral solicitude, as he puts it? We ontologize the objects of sexual desire. That is, we make them essentially definitional of who we are, expressive of who we are deep down inside, in a way that we don't loving hamburgers, for example. I'm not a hamburger lover in the same way that I might have a sexual identity. And we don't even do that with regard to whether we're vegetarians or omnivores or vegans, actually. It's sexuality preeminently in modernity that consolidates our sense of who we are, Foucault says. And he conceived of a work called The History of Sexuality to basically explain how we got to that point. And his exploration took him actually to very different territory. It took him, oddly, into ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and into early Christian theology, particularly of the patristic period, or the period of the early church fathers, in which he described a slow historical process by which human beings came to see sex as a peculiar problem. It's not true, Foucault says, that the ancient Greeks and Romans lived in a sort of pre-modern utopia of sexual liberation until the nasty Christians got on the scene and made a mess of everything by saying sex was evil. Ancient Christians actually inherited a great deal of their suspicion of sex from Greek and Roman philosophers like Diogenes the Cynic and Seneca the Stoic. Now, Foucault's not saying that Diogenes and Seneca problematized sex in the same way Christians would, but they started a conversation about it into which Christians inserted themselves in their own unique way. They were, the Greco-Roman philosophers of the first few centuries AD were concerned, for example, with the fact that sex was an act in which human beings were overwhelmed, overcome by the violent pleasures of their bodies in ways they worried could so compromise their bodies that they would become more prone to illness, for example. And Christians took up certain aspects of that suspicion of sex and further transformed them by putting them in the context of the fall of humanity from the book of Genesis and the crisis of desire that it creates. The work of St. Augustine is the prime example of this for Foucault. Augustine's concerned about sex for two reasons. The first is that sexual desire, what he calls concupiscence or lust, is a result of the fall of our first parents from grace. Okay, it's a result of Adam and Eve taking the forbidden fruit. And second, and by extension, he's concerned about the way that the sexual act necessarily involves a non-intentional, non-voluntary process of arousal, okay, whose evasion of our self-controlling wills Augustine thinks is a problem. And Augustine also thinks is emblematic or symbolic of the fall, whereby this sorry state of affairs was brought about to begin with. And that's where you get Augustine's famous, or I should say, infamous concern about the fact he cannot will his own erection. Okay, it's easy to make fun of Augustine for this, but it's easy enough to sympathize with it for anybody who's been out of sync, so to speak, with a sexual partner. Augustine intends, though, to go far beyond just pointing out the potentially inconvenient aspects of sex needing arousal in order to happen. The fact that sex involves arousal for Augustine, the fact that it evades the will's control, is actually one of the ways that sex has a dangerous character. Sexual desire has a propensity for Augustine to dominate and abuse the object of that desire, one's sexual partner, even as it dominates and abuses the one who's doing the desiring, who's passively battered back and forth by lust's vociferous demands, which always need more and more and more. So Augustine's problem with sexual pleasure, in other words, is that it's out of our control. That's what makes it evil. That's what makes sexual pleasure actually the very model or symbol of evil. Albeit an evil which is capable of being put to good use, he famously says, by married men and women who intend by sex to have children. In the fourth chapter of my dissertation, I'm trying to extend Foucault's analysis of the Christian problematization of pleasure, this way in which pleasure occurred to them historically, as problematic, past the 4th century in which Augustine was writing, into an epoch of Christian thought that Foucault tragically died, as he did, from complications from AIDS in 1984, before he could reach himself. And that's the work of the 16th century Carmelites, particularly the reformer Teresa of Avila and her friend and colleague John of the Cross, well known, I'm sure, to many of you who may be lovers of Christian mysticism, which is one of my great loves too. Teresa and John's work is concerned with problems presented by a different sort of pleasure than any of the ones that Augustine treats. It's a kind of pleasure that Augustine never considers. The pleasure had in prayer, and for lack of a better word, spiritual experience. Now, don't misunderstand me. Teresa and John don't consider any and all pleasure felt during prayer a problem. But they do find a particular kind of prayer pleasure spiritually harmful, even dangerous. And that's the sort that results in what they call spiritual gluttony. I love that term, spiritual gluttony, in which one begins to seek in prayer pleasurable feelings rather than seeking God. Okay? They're concerned with the potential for physical pleasure, even or especially when had in spiritual context, to arrest one's spiritual development by leading you not only to pursue more pleasures in prayer to the neglect of God, say, but to build one's entire spiritual identity around those pleasures, taking pride, for instance, in the fact that one finds prayer so enjoyable an activity. One loves praying and one's proud of that. As opposed to all those other spiritual dunces in your parish who loathe waking up early in the morning to do 30 minutes of centering prayer and say the office. You love it. And that's your whole identity is built around that. They claim instead that devotion to God does not automatically or necessarily actually result in enjoyable prayer experiences. It doesn't necessarily result in enjoyable experiences at all. And in fact, they think that spiritual development involves necessary periods of dryness or desolation in which one feels abandoned rather than loved by God. The dark nights of the soul, whose character and importance John of the Cross in particular was interested, maybe even obsessed with elaborating. These periods of dryness and spiritual pain actually serve as means for God to wean us off the pleasures of prayer and spiritual pursuit, so that we can be single-minded in our pursuit of God alone for God's own sake, not for how good or calm our meditation practices make us feel. Famously, Teresa and John believe that on the other side of these periods of weaning, these periods of dryness and desolation, is pleasure of a most intense and indescribably awesome sort. Okay, pleasure brought on, a bodily pleasure brought on by the union of the soul with God, but to which the soul no longer attaches, as it were, in the way that it did before. Ecstasies in which, to quote Teresa, the delight is so excessive that it seems to dissolve the soul. Pleasures that overwhelm the self, in which the self is totally out of control and beside itself in much the same way Augustine worried sex made us beside ourselves. So to sum up, Teresa and John's new elaboration of what makes pleasure a problem locates the problem specifically in the way that pleasure arrests one's spiritual progress, one's progress towards God, as spiritual gluttony causes one to become addicted, as it were, to prayer pleasure, so that one pursues that rather than closer communion at any cost, even if it doesn't feel good. The problem is no longer, as it was for Augustine, the way that pleasure comes from outside the self, overwhelms the self, or causes one to lose control. These are all characteristics, actually, of that ecstatic pleasure, which floods the soul at the height of the soul's journey towards God, after all. The problem with pleasure, instead, is attachment. Attachment to the pleasure itself, attachment to the sense of yourself that pleasure's pursuit gives you, and attachment, above all, to the world. Now, Teresa and John admittedly do not apply their more subtle problematization of sexual pleasure, of spiritual pleasure to sexual pleasure. They never make the theological leap. In fact, on my reading anyway, they say relatively little about sexual pleasure at all, which is especially odd, given just how erotic their descriptions of the soul's relation to God are. Presumably, this is because they assume that sexual pleasure is inherently selfish and self-centered, an act in which we get off at any expense, even that of the other, as it were. And so an act which is riddled with attachment to pleasure, self, and the world. But this is where I believe Teresa and John have much to learn from queer theory, particularly from folks like Leo Bressani and Anne Chetkovich, queer theorists who describe sexual pleasure as having more the character of the ecstasies John and Teresa celebrate than the spiritual gluttony they decry. Experiences that are neither selfish nor selfless, but actually self-disruptive or self-transcending. What Teresa and John assume characterizes pleasure of the highest spiritual sort, many queer theorists find to be analogously true of sexual pleasure to core, sexual pleasure as such. Bressani's theory is particularly indebted to Freud, for whom he suggests sexuality does not so much name a biological instinct, or a spiritual instinct for that matter, oriented towards reproduction and procreation, but a capacity which human beings develop very early on, even as infants, to receive external stimuli which overwhelm them in pleasurable ways. That is, as jouissance, or sexual pleasure. Jouissance being a kind of a French term, a psychoanalytic term of art for sexual pleasure. In his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud keeps returning, Bressani writes, to a line of speculation in which the sexual emerges as the jouissance of exploded limits, as the ecstatic suffering into which the human organism momentarily plunges when it is pressed beyond a certain threshold of endurance. What this means, and hang with me here, is that all sexual pleasure involves masochism. Involves, that is, in the strict sense, taking pleasure in an experience that really ought to be painful. That is, the experience of being flooded by a rush of physical stimulation which disturbs the very boundary between the self and the other, what Bressani describes as the shattering of the ego. This primary masochism, which is true of sexual pleasure in general, is put on display, advertised, as Bersani puts it, in penetrative sex between men. That's his prime example, which, viewed in the light of a homophobic culture, is a form of self-humiliation, at least for the man who's being penetrated. And Chekovich intervenes here to remind Bersani that there are a variety of ways that one might experience this pleasurable flood of physical stimulation in which sex consists, only one of which is the shattering of the ego or humiliation. Though all sex, she says, involves some sort of expansion or disruption of the self, not all people experience the shock in sex as a discarding of their selfhood or a crisis to their selfhood. And she suggests supplementing Bersani's description of gay cruising with the testimony of femme lesbians who, such as the writer of Joan Nessel in particular, who Nessel attests to the experience of rendering herself vulnerable to her lover only to actually receive a new self in return from her lover in the very gift of her pleasure, that a new self was actually contained in that pleasure. The making vulnerable that sex just is on Bersani and Chekovich's account, arguably on Freud's account, is an experience of being pleasurably overwhelmed by stimulation. And this process is complex and capable of having a variety of results. Perhaps a situation of profound and maybe even subversive passivity, or a situation of taking pleasure in something which one has hitherto foregone in shame, or a release from one's anxiety momentarily about the violence done by a homophobic culture to those who, like you, traffic in queer pleasures, or more precisely, those who, like you, traffic in acts that make obvious the queer character of pleasure as such. Queer sex acts make plain and obvious what is true of all sex, period, that sex is about pleasure, and specifically a pleasure which disturbs and disrupts our sense of ourselves. If that self-disturbance and self-disruption, if that jouissance sounds eerily similar to why Augustine was so worried about sexual pleasure in the first place, you'd be right on. But being beside yourself, as it were, in pleasure isn't automatically disqualifying for Teresa or John or somebody like them. Getting so caught up in your pleasure that you become attached to it and that you make the source of your pleasure the center of your focus in ways that distract you from your progress towards God, such that you perhaps think that the worldly pleasures of sex would be worth trading God for. That would be a problem for John or Teresa. But Teresa in particular doesn't think that bodily enjoyment necessarily involves that spiritually dangerous kind of attachment just because it's bodily. And she can't say bodily pleasure of that sort always or necessarily involves that kind of attachment, because that would disqualify all of her ecstatic raptures that she's so interested in. Nor does she think that God is the only acceptable object, actually, of that kind of intense bodily pleasure. It's possible for this joy simply to be prompted by creaturely beauty, for example. In her meditation on the Song of Songs, for instance, Teresa describes how extreme the joy is that the soul is sometimes made to feel about another created thing. Joy so intense that it seems like you are going to die. She says, I know a person who, while in this kind of prayer, heard someone with a beautiful voice singing. And she certifies that in her opinion, if the singing had not stopped, the soul would have gone out of itself on account of the great delight and sweetness the Lord gave it to enjoy. It seems to me then that on the queer theoretical account of sex I had a chance just briefly to describe this morning, neither John nor Teresa would find reason to single sex out as uniquely problematic among the body's pleasures. Not only does sexual pleasure not fortify the self in the way that Teresa and John find worrisome about spiritual gluttony and other spiritually derived forms of pleasure, it actually unsettles the self's boundaries in ways analogous to the spiritually induced ecstasies that they celebrate. It also trades on a kind of restlessness or dissatisfaction, even with the satisfaction that one is enjoying. Sexual pleasures each giving way to yet another higher, more intense form of pleasure. One's always on the way, as it were, never stopping, never halting, never attaching. This is an account of sex that basically grants, by the way, that St. Augustine is right about sex, at least about what sex is, even if he's not right about what sex is for. Augustine says sex is not fundamentally about love or even about making children. He thinks that's what sex is for, but the act itself is just lust. It's about the satiation of a thorn in the flesh called concupiscence, and what queer theory calls the drive, that which aims only towards its own satisfaction, that is, only towards the pleasures of the flesh. Except that what Augustine mourns and loathes, queer theorists find reason to celebrate. And I suggest Teresa and John would be hard-pressed to disqualify that experience, at least so far as it's a form of pleasure. And if that combination of Augustine and Freud means that sex no longer appears to be cut from the same cloth as marriage, say, then, well, that's a perfectly serious suggestion. Sex, I think, belongs to the catalog of what ancient Christians called passions, what Freud called instincts and drives. They're capable of good use and of ill, none of them entirely under our control, all of them dangerous in their own way, but none of them intrinsically evil for that reason. Uniquely among them, the sexual drive has no object other than pleasure. But as we suggested in the beginning, the fact that sex seems not to do anything valuable could actually be what is most significant, what is most precious about it, and what queer theology actually has most to teach us about sex, that we were made simply for joy. Thanks. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Justin, and that was a lot on a Sunday morning, in a variety of different ways. One of which is you're brilliant, so you bring in a lot of dense theological concepts, and it's hard to keep up with you sometimes. But also because I think, we to part of the point of your whole presentation, we don't like to talk about pleasure in church. We assume that pleasure is a bad thing. Even in our more progressive contexts. And in this month in which we're celebrating LGBTQ plus people, the LGBTQ plus community, we easily in the church make sexual orientation and gender identity things to celebrate, or not so easily, but more easily now than we ever did. And yet to actually talk about sex is something rare for us to do in church. We really don't like to go there often. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a symptom of, actually of this disturbing nature of sexual pleasure that the psychoanalytic tradition describes, and that queer theorists are picking up on. I'm interested in the fact that this is a kind of symptom, to use a psychoanalytic term, across the history of Christian thought, particularly actually acute in the 20th century. So in the chapter preceding the one that I was basically presenting to you today, I'm looking at the work of 20th century figures in Catholicism and Anglicanism, such as John Paul II, who as Pope promulgated his famous theology of the body, famous both for the way that it undergirds the refusal of Roman Catholics to ordain women, and also the classification of contraception as a moral evil. Both of those things, in addition to a heteronormative account of sexuality, the idea that the only who that you ought to do anything with is one of the opposite sex, considered in an essentially defining way, either male or female along a gender binary. All those things are derived in the 20th century Catholicism from his work. And yet it seems remarkably similar actually to the work of progressive Anglicans, like the Episcopal theologian Eugene Rogers, or actually Rowan Williams, notwithstanding all that I've learned from him, as I suggested this morning. All of them actually refuse to attend to pleasure in sex. They all make sex about something else. Rogers and Williams think that it's okay if it's okay for any people, regardless of their gender identities, to have sex. John Paul II clearly disagrees with that, but they both assume that sex is about something other than pleasure. And they actually both assume that it's about a loving communion, which images the relationship of the Trinitarian persons to each other. So there's this kind of constant, almost obsessional need in the church to say sex is not really about pleasure. It's not really about this thing. It's actually about love. It's actually about intimacy. It's actually about mutuality. It's actually about all of these other things. I'm unsure exactly what the cause of that is, except by just gesturing towards this perhaps psychologically disturbing character to sexual pleasure on a psychoanalytic understanding. But what I am convinced of is the fact of the symptom itself. I would totally agree with you.
So I encourage those of you who are watching, if you have questions, to send those in via the live chat function on YouTube, via the comments function on Facebook, or you can email them to me at pthompson@stbarts.org. Justin, we've been having, one of your teachers I know is Lynn Tonstad at Yale, and we've been reading her book, A Small Group of Us Have, on queer theology this month. And one of the things we've noticed in the book is how much queer theology intersects with the Black Lives Matter movement right now. We see so many parallels between the kind of vision she's outlining in the book and what's being articulated on the streets. And I'm wondering, I don't know if that necessarily speaks to your specific topic this morning, but I'm wondering if you can just reflect on what does queer theology have to say about this moment in terms of racial justice in this country?
Oh wow, totally. I'm actually gonna, if I could, take the liberty of responding with regard to like the question of sexual pleasure itself.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I'm sorry that I, because of the constraints of time and because there was already so much information, I didn't have a chance to speak about this. So I'm glad for the opportunity now. The work of scholars in Black feminist theory, in particular in the humanities, in the university, has been really illuminating for me in showing how this abundance of excessive pleasure, which is really at the heart of sex, period, is often projected onto Black bodies, which are considered to be voluptuous and out of control in a way that white bodies are not. Particularly the scholar Hortense Spillers, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, speaks about this as a process of basically a making queer of the Black subject in the process of being made a slave. To over-literalize something about the transatlantic journey actually reduces the Black body to flesh, reduces it to that voluptuous, out of control, lustful thing which Augustine calls the flesh. After St. Paul, it's not like he invented it, but anyway. The solution, I think, is difficult. The solution to that problem, which is one that scholars like Spillers think is true of the Black experience across the board, that they're constantly made to bear the burden of what is considered problematic or evil or dangerous. The solution that one wants to that sort of thing is something that's debated in both Black feminist theory and in queer theory, particularly around whether or not we want to be included in the realm of the safe, as it were, in the realm of the not lustful, in the realm of the not sexually voluptuous, not obsessed with pleasure, or whether we want actually to embrace our queerness, as it were, embrace the fact of our fleshiness, and use it in order to, as Spiller says, gain the insurgent ground on the norm. And I think that these sort of debates now throw earlier debates about Black power in the civil rights movement into somewhat new relief.
So again, I encourage those of you who have questions to send them in on YouTube, on Facebook, and send them in via email. Justin, I sense implicitly in your presentation today that queer theology has a message not just for LGBTQ plus people, but for all people. Can you talk a little bit about what queer theology says to those who may not identify as queer?
Totally. I've been suggesting all the way along that that queer does not name an identity so much. It's not a synonym for the alphabet soup, as it were, of LGBTQ plus. Rather, it is the name for what evades identity, for the name for something which all of us actually share, which society as a whole actually shares, but which it evades at any cost by accusing only a select group of people of having it. So I think that actually this, the insights that I've shared about sexual pleasure are to be had not simply by LGBT people, but if you follow them to their logical conclusion, by all of us. Sexuality is masochistic in character for every human being, actually. If people like Bersani are right. I'll say that, so I'm also in parish ministry. And so I understand that the material here is, it's incredible, dense and theoretical, philosophical in nature, and so on. I'll tell you, the way that I find this playing out in the spiritual lives of the people who I serve is that when I'm doing premarital counseling, I no longer counsel people to think that, no longer. I don't think that I ever did, but I'm especially not tempted any longer to tell people that sex is going to make their marriage work, because it won't. Sex is just a different sort of thing than marriage. Sex is something that can be had within marriage. It can be a part of a marriage. It could be a very important part of it, but it's not going to make your marriage magically. And I think that a lot of Christians have this sort of magical idea of sex, kind of analogous to what I was saying. People like Pope John Paul II and some even progressive Anglicans have. So sex is sex is not a bodily function, but a bodily phenomenon, which we kind of we make it mean what we make it mean. And I don't mean that to be dismissive of it. I mean that when I'm working with a couple in premarital counseling, or I'm talking to 8th grade confirmation students, I tell them that sex is really what you make of it. If you want it to communicate love, you need to surround it with a loving context. If you want it to communicate faithfulness, then you need to have sex in ways that communicate that faithfulness to another person. Sex is not all of these things automatically. Automatically, it's just pleasure. That's not something which I think is evil or bad or worthy of shame. That's the upshot of the theological account I've just said. But I actually think it actually gives us a profound spiritual opportunity, and taking hold of that spiritual opportunity is what I would encourage people to do.
So you've been talking about queer theology this morning, and but some of your thinkers that you've incorporated into the presentation are not theological. They're not theological thinkers. And I'm curious, what do you say to someone who says, why do we need the theology part of that? Why can't we just have queer thinkers? Or why do we need the church to think about sexuality at all if the church has been so sex negative and gotten it so wrong for so long? Why do we need the church at all? Why do we need to think about God in terms of these questions?
That's a fantastic question, Peter. There are people who would say that we don't need the church at all, and that the church is, as an institution, part of the problem. I tend not to think in such a wholesale way either about religion or about the church. I think that part of what I've tried to indicate in my work so far is that actually such unlikely bedfellows, as it were, as St. Augustine and Chekovich actually share a lot more in common than meets the eye. They might disagree about the rules, as it were. Augustine thinks presumably you should have very little sex because most of it's bad, or all of it's bad in some way. And Chekovich thinks presumably that those rules need no longer apply. But they both think about sex in a very similar way. And like it or not, the theological heritage is a part of what gets Chekovich to where she is. You have no Freud without Augustine. It's part of the point that Foucault is making. Christianity is in our social and even psychological DNA, as it were, regardless of whether we find it to be metaphysically true or convincing. But I would also say, just as a plug, as somebody who obviously does believe that it's metaphysically true and interesting. Metaphysically true, not to mention interesting. If queer theology, if queer theory specifically, leaving the theology bit to the side, is about that which escapes classification, about that which is ineluctably mysterious, about that which evades all control, the same can be said of God. Now, I'm not saying that God and queerness are interchangeable terms, but I am saying that Christians have worked really hard over 2,000 years to come up with ways of talking about something which is beyond all of our talk, something which evades our attempts to classify it. And the reason actually for my interest in both sexuality and in God, or one of the reasons for my interest in both of those things, is that they're both mysterious. That one is a mystery in the body and the psyche, and the other is the mystery that brought the body and the psyche into being, as well as the whole world, out of nothing. And it's that sense of mysteriousness, actually, that I think makes sexuality, as well as God, so compelling.
We have a question about the sort of practical implications. I know not all theologians want to answer that question, but how can the church frame sex differently to kind of take us out of the sex negativity of much of our heritage of Western Christianity?
Totally. That's an excellent question. Because that's exactly what I want. That's exactly what I want to do, actually. That's exactly what I want this project to be useful. I think we can do one main thing. If I have a practical upshot to, my 200 some page dissertation, it's really only that we would take one step, which is that we would, as a church, begin to reflect on sexual pleasure as such in an unembarrassed, frank way, and not jump too quickly to marriage. Rowan Williams points this out actually in his address, The Body's Grace. He says that heterosexual married couples can often stop at whether or not the sex acts that they're performing are permissible, and ostensibly they're permissible because they're done inside of marriage, as though there's nothing else to say actually about sex, nothing else interesting to say about sex. And I think that's the short circuit, a potentially incredibly spiritually valuable conversation, one that might lead us into precarious territory, troubling territory even, one that might change the way that the church thinks about sex, not to mention marriage. But the first thing that we can do is to not just jump to marriage, not even just to jump with the question of who can do what with whom. And that's been most of what the Episcopal Church's conversation has been so far, overwhelmingly so. It's just been about who can do what with whom. The can piece has been about the ethical question. And I want to invite people to say, well, what if sex is pleasure? What if we were unembarrassed about it? What does that mean? I think if we could have that conversation as a church, that would be a step in the right direction.
Well, we'll see. Thank you very much, Justin. We've approached the end of our time, and we're just very grateful that you could spend this time recognizing Pride Month with us. I'm sure my email inbox is going to be very interesting this week after your presentation. But I thank you for being with us and opening our minds this morning. and thank you for all you're doing in the church and in the academy.
Thanks so much, Peter. Wish you God's richest blessings, and also too, sorry for your inbox. If anybody wants to email me, I'm happy to I'm happy to field some of that myself. You can find my email address at stmarksnewcanaan.org.
Oh, don't worry, I'll send them your way, Justin.
I look forward to it. God bless you all. Thanks so much for the privilege of being with you.
Thank you all.